I'd love to open it up to the crowd, and we have a question right back here.
Morning, and thank you. My name is Rafael Grossman. I'm an immigrant myself from Venezuela. I've been in Maine for 13 years. Me and my wife, my kids, came here looking for a better life. But my question is I think it's kind of simple. With your expertise, would you share a particular practical word of advice, especially for the younger people in the audience? There's a lot of students in here, high school students and college and graduate students from Maine who are listening to this, and they'll come back with a lot of empathy, or more empathy maybe, about this issue of refugees, which hits home in Maine very, very incredibly. The immigration ban, for example, affects healthcare system in Maine. I'm a surgeon myself, tremendously. Healthcare cannot be possible in Maine without foreigners coming to Maine to work. It's just not possible. So all these young people, and the older people in the audience as well, particular advice for them to get out of here with what to do next, to not just be empathic with this issue, but to do something, to make a change. All of you, Gerald and Karen, you talked about not just talking, but doing things, making it happen. How do you, so resources, to where do you go to then, I just don't want to be, happy with this issue. Happy to know about this issue and empathic, but how do I help? How do I make a change? And especially here in Maine, we have a state that it's larger than Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont together. We have like 1.2 million inhabitants. We have a lot of room for immigrants, for refugees.
Maybe we'll take that question both from the source of refugees. Maybe Maha, you can comment on that, how perhaps Mainers can help in the challenge, and then on places that as host communities. Gerald, maybe you can speak on that from the concept of Europe, what Mainers could sort of replicate, that you're seeing some of the best actions in Europe. So Maha, any way that we in Maine can help what's happening in the Middle East?
Push back. Push back. I think what we've seen over the past 2 weeks, particularly with the travel ban, has been very heartening for people across the region. The sense of solidarity, the sense of empathy, but also the sense that this is what happens when you have actual institutions. This is what we want back home. So I think on this sense already you've made a positive difference. In practical terms, I think pushing back through your congresswoman who's here, but also through petitions. Any way that you can push back in terms of the lash out against refugees, making it clear that being a refugee is not synonymous with being a terrorist, that a security perspective on the question of refugees is not only inhumane, but actually is absolutely inaccurate. And there are different organizations that are already trying to do that.
And Gerald, how can we be a better host community?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to push back on the discourse of futility. The sense that human beings are all tribal, that in the end, mixing different religions doesn't work. This is such a bizarre idea, seeing from the United States, but it's bizarre from every city in Europe. It's so bizarre that it's striking that politicians get up with this and get away with this sometimes. And I think one of the things to push back on is, take the European story. In the last few years, what made it possible to welcome and receive hundreds of thousands of people in a very short period of time in countries like Germany or Sweden, which I want to highlight, has taken per capita many more even than Germany, because it has a very good reception system. And what made this possible is the volunteers. And these stories need to be told, because the discourse we get, because it makes more news when there is a crisis, there's a terrorist attack, there is insecurity fears. The fact that in Germany or Sweden you had millions of people participate as volunteers. I was just in the city of Hamburg, where they've set up a relief organization where people donate, but because Hamburg is a port, all these people in civil society who work for free in these NGOs, in their other life, they are logistics experts. So they set up this thing with barcodes for all the shoes that were being brought there. And they can trace. I looked at this, I think, you're a not-for-profit NGOs which doesn't pay its staff? This kind of story needs to be told. And And the second thing is just in one line is politics. I think what we've seen in Germany, in Europe, and we see it in the United States, is that in the end, civil society plays a key role, but in the end, voting for people who are in favor of refugee rights is the most fundamental thing one can do.
Thank you. Got a question up here. And thank you.
Good morning. I'm Daryl Ibavisi. We're from Salem, Mass., but our sailboat lives in Rockport. I think my question is for Karen, and it deals with the status of the UN agreement vis-a-vis the United States. Is it a treaty? What is the nature of the obligation? Is it a treaty? Is it some other kind of obligation? Is it in effect? Is it a legal obligation? If so, what would it take the current administration to undo it? And in the meantime, can anyone withstanding sue for its compliance? Thank you.
I wish all of that were possible. But as I said, maybe you missed the word. I said that these are non-binding, so they're not legal. They're just all the states, all the heads of states have made a promise. They've signed up to these things, and so we have to count on them. And that's why, instead of maybe push back, if I can go to that, I would say that we need to push forward as people. You're all here because you're interested in these topics. You must have friends or neighbors or others who aren't here. So tell them what you've learned and try to mobilize other people. And then they will, and you will mobilize your politicians, we hope, to think positively. Because if they know that you're going to vote for them if they do the right thing, they will do the right thing. So.
Okay. A question over here?
Hi, I'm Shelley Pingree. And I live right here in Knox County. Actually, this is the northernmost town in the 1st Congressional District, and I live on the island of North Haven, so happy to be a neighbor to Camden. And first, just thank you to everybody who helps put this conference on, and to all of you who are here and in the remote locations, because I can say from the part of a political representative, there's nothing more heartening than the turnout for a conference like this, people watching online, or the people who showed up at the airport, or who have already voiced their opinion and done exactly what you've suggested, pushed back. It's very hard to serve in these challenging times where the answers aren't that evident, and the fact that part of what we need is this somewhat long-term change of people understanding who the refugee and asylum seekers are, who are the people who come to our office every day asking for help with this very complicated system, or how to get through the very limited number of people who will now be allowed into the country this year because of the president cutting the ban in half, or cutting the number in half. So a lot of challenges, and some of these things were already addressed, but I'm interested, since you're an expert panel, and I'm so fortunate to be able to spend the time here with you today. When you think about it from the side of government, not just the importance of everyone here pushing back, which really does make a huge difference and lets people know that there are other sides to this story. But if you were to think about what you, in my role, or others that are in my role, need to fight for in the short run, funding streams, particular pieces of law, things that we can't let escape our eye. There will be the big fights around, whatever next week's ban looks like, and the legal fights of looking for standing, or the wall and the cost of the wall. And I think there'll be some big funding issues coming down that we'll be able to fight on. But you know what I'm talking about. You all work at the UN, you work in this kind of policy, and a lot of things most of us in my job aren't that familiar with. So what are the things that you would fight to hang on to, the money that is really important, or what, if you could push a few things that, as you said, aren't really front and center today, but that you could try to push for, that are maybe a little bit wonky or policy-wise, but you could give me a little help while I'm here today.
Paul, you can start, and then Karen, maybe you could give a few thoughts on it.
It's a process which requires pushing in 1,000 directions at the same time, and that's part of the problem. So the priority will be different in different states, because we're seeing differences from Arizona to Maine, where different legislature are taking different directions. What I would suggest is that you take both a global perspective and a local perspective at the same time. And one of the things is that very question of signing up to a UN agreement. That is, it's an international agreement, and it was one that has held the world together for the last 50 years, 40 years. And so under those circumstances, the argument becomes that if we withdraw from those kinds of agreements, we're actually setting off on our own in a way that will not be able to cope with the kinds of conditions that this global crisis is causing. When you get down to the local level, it will include things which I don't know about, but they'll be the things which are about the pushing forward. There'll be things which include local support for engagement across communities, in the same way that Jared was talking about what's happening in Europe. That is, where people come together around actual activities, and they'll include things like health and welfare, where certain kinds of legislation or certain kinds of engagement will allow communities to work together, and I think that's the key part of it, where you bring refugees into work for the process rather than treat them as just welfare recipients. And so they become part of a process of community engagement which has to be ongoing, because what's happening in Europe, but also in the United States, is a cleavage of communities around those questions of how we are to live in community with others who are different from us. And I think one of the basic things that was a mistaken metaphor which was used for the United States, which was called the melting pot, I think was completely wrong. A melting pot dissolves difference. And what we have are multiple differences which should be celebrated even as they're concerned and uncomfortable. We need a different kind of multiculturalism, which is uncomfortable multiculturalism, where people learn to live with difference and celebrate that difference by working together in things like healthcare or welfare or education or working at the local library. And under those circumstances, I think we can make a major difference.
Karen, you just want to...
No, just to add a couple of things, that was pretty conclusive, I say. One, that we talk about a mosaic instead of a melting pot. You know, we all come with what we have, and we share that and learn from each other and enjoy each other, that diversity. We kept talking about beauty of diversity, even though, as I always say, I told some people that I'm from a small town in Ohio. I know the pushback against diversity. People want to be all the same in their own little community, so we have to work on that. But locally, what you can do, of course, is the push on the resettlement things, on things that you could do as an NGO or a local group anywhere to let people come into your community.
We have a lot of questions here in the Opera House, but I do want to go to one of our remote locations, so I have a queue going, but let's hear from Belfast. We see innocents escaping war and oppression. What about how to get rid of the oppressors? The most important question. Would you like to? Everyone's got an answer on this one. Let's take a couple.
Actually, when I was thinking I should have also added to the question on the pushback is that there needs to be not only pushback in terms of the refugee ban in the US, but also a much more systematic and concrete engagement with the conflicts that are happening. A real push to find a just political solution, not just any political solution, and one that recognizes what has been going on. Part of the problem in Syria is that the US did withdraw. For better or worse, it did withdraw. It withdrew from its political engagement in the context and left it an open playing field. And here is where we are. I mean, this has driven the conflict in many ways, in many atrocious ways, to the point where today the current regime that is responsible, since it is the regime in power, for the death of almost 500,000 Syrians, well, 400,000. Atrocious destruction to lives and livelihoods. So I think the push forward for a real engagement in the political process, not just sitting on the sideline and letting others run the show, and by others here, in the particular case of Syria, I mean Russia and Iran, there needs to be a serious, turning inwards is only going to, it's not just threatening the Western liberal order, the open societies, open borders, I mean, everything we've been talking about and others are talking about. But turning inwards, I think, is a mechanism that will allow even more atrocious acts to emerge. For me, the emergence of ISIS, for example, is one manifestation of this hunkering down to very unique identities It's part of the reaction and anger against greater inequities, against oppressive policies. They feed off this anger. I mean, they have fed off this anger across the world and across the region. So I would say more political engagement at multiple levels and with the aim of achieving a just political solution.
Gerald, just a couple more comments, and then we have a bunch of questions out here. So if you want to add.
Just to give one personal example, I worked for 4 years in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, right after the war. And there was a very strong US push, which was extremely successful to support the idea at that time of an international tribunal for war crimes. And what happened in Bosnia was that the war was fought for more than 3 years over the idea of expelling others. I mean, there were half the population of Bosnia was internally displaced or outside of the country. I mean, this was the war aim. This wasn't a side effect. And to be able to put on trial, to first indict and then put on trial the project of ethnic cleansing itself was crucial to allow some people to return to their homes. And I saw it. I worked in Bosnia in a very pre-war ethnically mixed area. There had been horrific massacres in central Bosnia. And when the first people were indicted from that region who'd been involved in ethnic cleansing, and then others fled because they were afraid they would be arrested by, among others, US soldiers who were there. When this happened, that's when people who had been displaced had the confidence to perhaps return again. Even the peace alone would not have led them to return without some accountability and justice. And this was very, very important. And the end result, if anybody ever goes to Bosnia on vacation, go to Doboj, which is in central Bosnia, where there was not all the Bosniaks or Muslims were expelled. Today, 1/3, almost half of the Bosniaks who've been expelled in this town controlled by Serb warlords have returned, and you hear the call to prayer from the mosques again in the center of Doboj, which would not have been possible without some of the worst people in Doboj being brought to justice. So international justice, if it's well done, supported in that case by the United States, for the culprits, the oppressors, that's a very important tool.
Could I respond to that? Because and I agree entirely with what Jared has said, but I want to respond directly to that question and use the Bosnian case. I was part of a group which organised the first reconciliation summit in Bosnia, the 10th anniversary of Srebrenica. And we went to families' homes where a Serbian would be living downstairs because the person who was the original Bosniak owner could only feel safe if they brought a person in who was of the opposite ethnicity to give them safety. And I think the process of that War Crimes Tribunal made a big difference. However, I want to go to the question of who are the oppressors, and it's never as clear as we are putting. What tends to happen in those situations is that they are complicated situations which require multilateral United Nations activities of a consequence where if the United Nations goes in alone, it often causes problems. And I'm going to use the example of Bosnia to describe that. There was a campaign in the United States to describe Milosevic as the evil person who was causing the ethnic cleansing. And what we now know is rather than all the deaths that were supposed to have occurred before the American bombing began, is that most of the deaths in Kosovo actually occurred after the bombing began. And the Milosevic, evil as he was, and he should have been tried for war crimes, but they were war crimes of omission rather than war crimes of running an ethnic cleansing process. And the ethnic cleansing was through multiple organisations, including UCHCA and including different organisations in Bosnia and Kosovo, where ethnic cleansing became a way of life for people, where local people engaged in this. Now, that is the complication we face, and it's not a matter of saying, that person's the cause, take them to a war crimes tribunal and you will solve the problem. You need to have both. You need the war crimes tribunal, you need reconciliation processes, and you need clarity of policy, which is not blaming a single person, but what was a change that occurred over a period of 3 to 5 years.
Let's go here.
Good morning. I'm Fabiola. I live in Guatemala, serving for the American Friends Service Committee. So I have 2 issues I would like to highlight. One is the migration industry. I think so that's not a strange term for any of you, but I think so that maybe we also can discuss about What's the role of this migration industry? We know it's a growing industry, particularly in the United States and in Latin America, where many private industries are getting profit of that. And probably I can list a number of them. One of them is the detention centers that we call prisons that are managed by private industries with very good profits. Also, we can talk about the banks in the region that grant loans to people to use it for pay to the coyotes, we call them coyotes, or people traffickers. Also, we can talk about the militarization of the borders. The militarization of the borders also benefits a lot of the big armed trade industries in the world. And this is not only US, this really involves industries from everywhere in the world. So I think this is something that we could keep in our minds because besides all the humanitarian crisis, also there is economical and very important benefits that probably also need to be addressed in order to support in some way the reduction of this crisis. And the second thing I would like to highlight is Cartagena Agreement. Cartagena Agreement, it's 30 years of conversations. We are now getting into the 32nd year. And I have to say that I recognize it's a very good intention agreement, but we follow up directly what are the responses from the governments to these recommendations. And as you say, it's a non-binding agreement. So 2 years after, we can say that very little has been done. And in the contrary, many governments have increased their tough measures against people transiting in the region. And every day we can see that borders are getting closer, measures are getting more and more drastic, and more people is having their basic rights not respected. So as very well-known people in the panel, I would like to know, what do you think about this? What is the real future we can expect with these panoramas? Thanks.
Thank you. We've got lots of questions going. Gerald, do you want to talk about the monetization of some of the borders? Is that some?
Well, I must say, as a European, the notion of private prisons strikes me as strange. I just read an article in the Netherlands where it turned out that they have a serious problem with their prisons. There aren't enough prisoners. They are run by the state, but there is no lobby to fill them because the state is happy to cut back. And the same, of course, would be true for private detention centers. I think, going down this route is definitely a very bad idea. I mean, there should be public authorities responsible, and then you could put pressure on them. They should be held to standards. I think one of the problems of the business of smuggling, of course, is, I mean, anybody who's talked to refugees knows how horrific many smugglers are. I know in the case of Greece and Turkey, and now, of course, you see it in Libya, people pay and then they turn up at the beach and then they are supposed to be 30 in a boat, and then the smugglers with a gun force 70 into the boat, which increases the risk enormously, and then the boat is sent off and then the motor stops working. I mean, we've all heard these stories. So I think any moral opprobrium that these smugglers, I mean, they are really criminals, but we're not going to solve the problem of irregular migration based on the idea that we can get rid of the smugglers. Because this idea of one mafia-style organic industry with a hierarchy is just not what is happening. I mean, in many cases, in the Balkans, in Southeast Europe, it's people earn a lot of money, but the smugglers are easily replaced if we don't address the demand. And that is one of the key challenges, how you do that. What we saw in the Aegean was that for a few years, I mean, for a few months, hundreds of thousands of people paid huge amounts to smugglers. And then the whole business collapsed because something changed on the demand side. Not because all these smugglers stopped wanting to sell their goods, which is exploitation to get people across in dangerous boats. So I think, yes, fight the smugglers. It is a cynical and murderous business, but it will not be the solution. The solution is better policies.
Quick, and then we'll
I'll take the non-European perspective, which is almost the same. In fact, the issue in Australia and in New Zealand and in such places across Southeast Asia is the smugglers are being used as a mechanism for blaming, again, another intermediary who's actually as evil as you describe and as difficult and as problematic, mostly they're Indonesian fishermen who are making a living. Mostly they're low-level people. There's no great system involved, and these people are being treated as somehow to blame for a worldwide and global problem. And under those circumstances, it becomes too easy for the government to describe that. But to go back to the first part of your question, yes, just as war and just as every aspect of, I think of Timor as a very good example of the way in which you described. When the United Nations, for all of its wonder and glory, went into the United Nations, went into East Timor, and Timor-Leste became an independent nation state across a process of the millennium where they were trying to battle against Indonesian oppression. The United Nations, just by being there, commercialized the entire event. And the local people were earning less than the volunteers were being paid. And that changed the economy completely. Now, if you went to the Mexican border and you talk about $18 billion being spent on Homeland Security as opposed to $8 billion being spent on the FBI, you have some sense of the magnitude of the money that's being spent on stopping people coming across borders. That money is being spent on a lot of private contractors as well as all sorts of other activities. And at the moment, with so much money invested in this process, we could actually think of investing in other areas, including reception and support for refugees.
Let's go up here.
Bill Jones from Hope, which is in Chelly's district and somewhat north of Camden. I want to ask particularly Mrs. Yahya to reflect on possible solutions in Syria. I'm asking this because I'm less interested in what we can do about the results of this ghastly situation, but the supply of people who want to migrate. They want to migrate because the conditions are ghastly. It's death and oppression, and somehow something has to be done at the supply end to make life better. In Syria, you have a situation where the Alawi minority came to power a long time ago. They were socialists at the time, but now they've done terrible things. Most of my Sunni friends will attest to this. They can't last forever. The amount of support the Russians will give for their naval base is limited. There has to be a way found out so that the Alawi can be got out of control. It's a bit like the whites in South Africa.
Maybe we can turn and see what our
Tutsis
specialist has to answer with that.
Can you see a way out? Suppose you were an Alawi in Syria. How can you conceive of a way out that stop them from fighting the way they are?
Okay.
Well, first I have to object a little bit to the description. It's not the Alawi community that is massacring Syrians. I would not want to demonize an entire community because its president and his entourage are committing war crimes. In the same way, I mean, ISIS is predominantly Sunni, and they've committed a lot of atrocities against, actually their first targets are Muslims. So I would steer clear of describing the conflict in Syria or in Iraq or anywhere else in sectarian and ethnic terms. The uprising started as a result of a demand for freedom, challenges to governance. Now, where do we move forward? I think that, we need to go back to the Geneva Declaration of 2012. This was under Kofi Annan. There was a roadmap. There was a political process that was put in place. This war will not end with a military victory, neither by the regime. Even if the regime was today to take over all of Syria again, it does not have the power nor the human resources to control the country once more. And it was very evident maybe a few months ago when they took over the city of Palmyra, and the moment they had to diverge troops to Aleppo, Palmyra fell again to ISIS. So they do not have the capacity to coerce populations under their thumb as a regime. And the regime actually is controlled by an Alawi president that has many Sunnis present in it as well. So I would say that return to the political process, but a political process that recognizes the rights and that brings in the voices. At this point, the political process that is happening between the armed factions, which is the minority of Syrians. The more vocal, the more civic, the unarmed majority are not being talked to, they are not being engaged in what can happen to the future of their own country. And this is where some of the most creative ideas about power sharing, about what does it mean to devolve. I mean, there are concrete issues that need to be addressed. Do you maintain the powers with the presidents? How is Syria going to be governed? What kind of guarantees do you offer communities without turning into a federal system of different ethnicities, which would mean more bloodshed and would set the seeds of conflict down the road? So I think there are fundamental issues around which a peace process can evolve, specifically in terms of how do you govern and who governs, what kind of powers the president should maintain, what kind of powers the prime minister, the government, what is the relationship of the center to the periphery. There are concrete issues that can be, how do you maintain a civic-based, a secular-based governance system, but that also provides the kind of guarantees that a large number of communities within the country need. So yes, we're talking about mosaics. We're talking about, we never talk about, for example, we never talk about minorities and majorities. This is a language we just don't use anymore. It's more about social diversity and how do you maintain this diversity in the country.
Great. We have a lot of questions coming. This is great. I am going to go to one of our remote sites just to make sure that we hear from them. How to address possible infiltration of extremists while opening to nonviolent refugees from Mali and Rockland. Who would like to go one at a time now?
I think it's a non-issue.
Okay, there you go. All right. I think we can leave it simple as that.
I think governments have been using that as an excuse. I think it's very straightforward. The numbers of people who have come across borders through that mechanism is so remarkably few as to be a total misleading and misunderstanding of the process of how terrorism gets into a country. Terrorists are here already. Terrorists are born, grow, feel aggrieved, part of a complex understanding. Terrorism is not from people who are coming from below. It's also from people who are going to agricultural and engineering colleges in the United States. They're often well-educated people, and they're people who have other means of, if they wanted to come as a planned movement, they have other means of getting here, and mostly by aeroplane and mostly by business class.
Let's go over here.
I'm from Manchester, Maine, and I was at this conference last year where a very thoughtful governor of the Central Bank of Tanzania pointed out that while Africa was experiencing annual increases in GDP, the population growth was far greater, and Africa, already an importer of food, was going to be in even more extreme circumstances within the next 30 years as the population exceeded 2 billion people. Earlier, Mr. Knaus pointed out that there were something like 200,000 African and Asian refugees who made it to Europe a couple of years ago. But if there are millions of people who are going to be in extreme poverty, extreme hunger, extreme insecurity, physical insecurity, I think most reasonable people would conclude that's beyond the carrying capacity, as Ms. Yahya pointed out, is already the case in Lebanon, of even an entire continent. So it seems to me that it gets to addressing the root causes of forcing people into refugee status in the first place, and that in response to Congressman Pinger's point, we should be concerned, and Europe should be concerned about addressing the root causes so people don't need to flee by reducing population growth, by increasing food productivity, by the West and the United Nations insisting on more democratic governments in places like Eritrea, which should be taking care of themselves, rather than everyone having a right to show up on our doorsteps and expect us to take care of these problems here rather than at the root cause.
Karen, can I turn to you? You've traveled all over the world, that development perspective, that sort of how do we address the root causes better? Are there things that we specifically can do?
Simple question.
Yes, a simple one.
And I've been thinking about that since one of those earlier questions about who are the oppressors. And that,
Oh, your mic.
what's happening? Who are the oppressors? We have to think about.
Karen, put it up.
Can you hold? Yeah, put it.
There.
It's turned off, I think.
All right. Here we go. Thank you.
No, that question that came earlier, being an old lefty, but we need to think about all the countries that are not the ones that are in our sights all the time, these big crises that are sending people, and we think they're, well, terrorists or not. But we are not looking at all the failed states there are out there that we don't hear so much about. What are your statistics this morning said the most people were coming from Eritrea and Nigeria? Well, we need to look at those kinds of, we need to look at all the countries where the leaders stay on for decades and decades. This is where the people are waiting to come out and create a problem somewhere. So we need to be more international and more aware of what's going on in many parts of the world and trying to do something about some of those things.
And perhaps invest in helping that happen.
Humanitarian financing, political financing.
Let's go up here to the balcony.
Hi, I'm Zach from the University of Maine. Yeah, thank you for speaking today. You spoke about minority groups in Syria and Iraq, like the Yazidis, Shabaks, and Turkmens, who are being persecuted at an alarming rate, and were afraid of returning home because they couldn't trust the government in protecting them or even their neighbors. Do you think these people should be prioritized in the immigration/refugee processes?
This is a very tough question because there is the moral ground of providing asylum to people who desperately need it. But then the big concern in the region is that it's quickly being depleted of this social diversity and this mosaic that has coexisted for decades, actually for centuries in the region. So it's a very tough question to say. Should they be prioritized? I don't think that, I think priority should not be based on ethnic or sectarian identity. It should be based really on those in need who are the ones who are most in need. You will find people who are most in need who are not necessarily from these particular minorities. But there is a real concern also that prioritizing specific social groups is actually depleting the region of one of its sources of riches, if you want. What makes that region special in many ways.
We're running low on time, but I want to make sure we get a couple more questions in. If you can be very concise with your questions, and we will commit to that in our answers as well.
My name is Bob Tuttenauer, and I live in Otis, Massachusetts, which is a small, lovely, I guess you could consider it a blue-collar town. The local people there are contractors and builders. We have restaurants and things like that. And I sort of fantasized that I was the mayor, and I was going to open up our town on a humanitarian basis to refugees and migrants. But then I had to figure out how I was going to pay them, how I was going to create jobs and work for them so that they didn't come in and sort of take away, I'd overcome fears of people losing their jobs. But then I thought, Gerald, I was thinking about on a more global scale with Germany and Sweden and England, what is the strategy to absorb these millions and millions of people and to let them have, or to create work and jobs for them? You don't want to create a welfare segment in that society, so you're going to prepare for them, you'll give them homes and things like that. What does a Merkel do to just jumpstart a sophisticated economy such as Germany to absorb these people and give them jobs?
Yeah.
That's a very, very good question, which a lot of mayors, like you of your town, in Germany ask as well. And the answer in the last 2 years that the German government has given is, first, there is an incredible amount of federal money, I mean, from the central government that goes to the federal states and cities in Germany. a huge budget of more than 100 billion euros, which goes very much into education. The idea is that every child of asylum seekers whose status isn't regulated yet, but even if they're waiting for an asylum decision, every child of school age should be going to school. One of the earliest decisions that the German government made, Angela Merkel made, was to make the head of the asylum office the former head of the German Federal Employment Agency, to actually send a signal that the whole issue of employability and education and training is very, very important. Language is incredibly important. I mean, in a country like Sweden or Germany, if you don't have the language, it is very difficult to work on the labor market. Having had 3 little girls who went to schools in different countries, who always picked up the languages faster than I did, you can see the potential if schooling is organized well. In Germany, just one last point, in the school of my children, it's the French school in Berlin, the lycée, there is, like in all the German schools, a class now, these are these special classes, which is refugees, and the idea is to help them with special training so that as quickly as possible within a year they can be integrated in other classes. You know, it's these kinds of investments, and actually, if you're the mayor, I would insist that the government doesn't leave you alone, because clearly these are challenges that require national support.
Looking at the big boss up there. One more question? No. Okay. Thank you all very much. This has been a really, really wonderful panel. Wonderful questions.